We're going to talk about how can facilities play a role in assisting you in becoming embedded. Because we do find that there are buildings that are not very good buildings at facilitating that sort of thing. And that's what we're here to hear about this morning, is how do we become integral to the community. That question that was asked earlier about if you disappeared, would your community notice? Would they care? When Steve Poe asked that question, we talk about that all the time. Are you anonymous to the community? Are you embedded in the community? And if you're not, how can we create a people flow through your building in order for that to be a reality? How does that happen? And let me tell you right off the bat that, first of all, this whole notion of 6 keys, it's tough. Sometimes these things get a little bit out of order, but we start with mission. I want to know what you are about before we start talking about any buildings. Because at the end of the day, a building may not be in your future. It may not be the answer for you. I am not there to foist a building project on a group that shouldn't be really building a building or building a building yet. There are times when you ought to pause, stop, and ask questions that are more meaningful questions than how big and how much money. So getting involved in mission for me is key. Identifying needs is key. And I got to tell you, that discussion of identifying needs is almost always going past budget. That happens all the time. So we talk back and forth about that, about how many different ways can you use a space? How can you do that to make space work best? Creating people flow. We learned this from a church in Chula Vista, California that we did 10 years ago. They're doing phase 2. We're in the midst of it right now. We started the project 10 years ago. It took them 4 years to get their building built. Because in California, you've got to appropriate the money for your building, you've got to appropriate the money for your site, and you've got to appropriate the other third of your money for community enhancements, bike paths across town. The community leaders get the church's arm behind their back and say, you want approval for your project? Fund our bike paths. That's the way it works in California in a lot of the communities. So it took them 4 years to get their building built. The day they opened their building, in the big grand opening, people were showing up and saying, hey, this is great. Can we have our yoga class here, our exercise class? Can we have our cheer class? Can we have our taekwondo class? Can we have our Boy Scouts meet here? Can we do this? Can we do that? And their answer for several months was, we're not really set up to do that. We have a limited staff. We can't be here at night to lock and unlock doors. That doesn't work. That's not sustainable for us. So that summer, they opened the building, I think in February. That summer, they had 2 interns come into the church. And they were trying to figure out, sometimes you have these folks come in to be interns in your office. We do that all the time. We're trying to figure out, okay, what can I get you to do? They said, you lock and unlock doors, you control schedule, and charge a fee. They figured out pretty quickly that they were getting eaten out of house and home just in terms of C-fold paper towels and toilet paper in cleaning. There are realities to this. So they set up a very intentional quid pro quo relationship, a business relationship with these individual organizations, and they were more than glad to pay for it. They were busting the doors down. Inside a year, they had 1,200 people who did not go to their church, 1,200 people a week coming through their building. Create people flow. Then they figured out, let's connect to them. So they started offering, they were coming in for a yoga class. They started offering things like Christian parenting, free Christian parenting classes. Now, some of these moms were struggling. They didn't know how to parent kids. They were new moms. And they were showing up, and what was happening in the parenting classes is these older folks in the church were teaching how to parent from a Christian perspective and forging relationships that were eventually leading to the obvious, which is join us in worship, join us in church, join us for the next stage. Come to our third place space and hang out with us and get a cup of coffee on Sunday mornings. These are embedded ministries now. They're creating people flow. They had become a de facto community center, and they were sustained in income by the charges that they were, when you have 1,200 people a week coming through your building, and everybody's getting charged a $1 service fee for the use of the building, it adds up pretty quickly. That's why they're well into their second phase 4 years after they opened their building. Because suddenly they're growing. They're a building that when that question gets asked, would they miss you? They would be devastated by the loss of this church. because that building has become integral to who they are as a community. It's a tool for them to be able to get to know them. Let's talk about mission. Mission is going to be crucially important for us to talk about, and we got to get it in the right order. Sometimes people want to talk about the building long before they talk about mission, but we talk about mission, we talk about the activities that are derived from that mission, how many different ways are going to spring from this, and what does it imply in terms of facility. If you need to build something, and that's not always the case, can you accomplish this another way? How many times have we been in a situation where we realize we can do this because I saw this church doing this over in Tucson this way, could you do it that way? We can bring corporate knowledge. I happen to work in an area where people are more than willing to share their good ideas. Businesses, they make me sign non-disclosure agreements. I've never had a church ask me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. We figured it out. We know how to get into the community. Don't tell anybody. They all want to talk about it because we're all in it for the same thing. We're trying to build a kingdom, right? Whether I'm an architect or whether you guys are doing whatever you do in life, pastors or non-pastors, we are ministering. We are ministers in that area. We're trying to build a kingdom. That's a good way to do it. So we start with those questions. What is the story, what does your story tell you about the kind of church that God's called you to be? You know, so many times I go into these situations and they don't even know where to start to ask the question. And I'll tell them, start with your city. Go to your city leaders. They know where the needs are. They'll tell you where their pressure points are. Find out. One in Southern California said, we have an utter dearth of places for people to go coming out of drug rehab. So this guy starts a furniture reclamation business and brings in these guys coming out of prison programs to run the furniture reclamation and repair business. And they fund they have 5 locations now, they fund a 90-bed rehab center out of this place because they went to the city leaders and asked them, what are the problems here? And they said, we have all kinds of drug problems and people falling back into drug trafficking. Ask your city leaders. Find out. The StratOps thing will identify those things. Not to come in and tell you, but to start asking the right questions for you to ask yourself to identify these things and reveal these things. Start with mission. Don't mimic what others have done. So many people say, well, hey, I went and visited my kids over in Pittsburgh, and they're doing this great thing over there, and it has no application to their church. I mean, there are some good things. Sometimes people do bring some good things to light, but oftentimes they'll try to bring in the wrong idea for that community. So be careful. You are unique. Some years ago, we tried to start a program where we had these 12 buildings that we really liked, and we put them in a catalog, and we said, if we can get people to come in and choose one of these buildings instead of going through the rigmarole of starting from scratch, we can cut our fees way down and we can advance them a lot faster. I'll tell you what happened. Everybody that came in was so excited to get the catalog and say, yeah, we like that one, and then they would completely change it. Time after time after time, because everybody's ministry was unique. They would think of a different way to do it. Can we shift this over here and do that over here? No, we're destroying the whole purpose behind this. We're taking time now to do all that. They didn't care. They wanted what worked for them. Everybody's ministry is unique. Everybody has a different story to tell. This happens all the time too, where we find these hybrid churches that are in locations that go from they may be in a suburban location and half their group is coming in from a rural location, half's coming in from an urban location. And they have very different needs in their community. So you got to think strategically about how are we meeting these divergent groups that are out there? What do the demographics look like in the community? You know, what's going on? If we're in the midst of a group of, we just finished one down in Orlando, Florida, and they're in the midst, they're now moving into a location where it's nothing but apartment houses around them. The community is a very different community than what they're used to. The way that they're going to minister to these people that are renting instead of owning their homes is going to be very different. So we got to think about those kind of things. Ministry size plays a role. Ministry size has changed so much. I mean, this is a perfect example of this church. This church was a church of, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 people, William, some years ago. And they decided we want to address the needs of individual specific communities. So they started to break the mothership apart a little bit and risk that as a bold way to enter community. The whole way that people thought 10 years ago, everybody wanted to be a megachurch. Today, everybody doesn't want to be a megachurch. They want to be a community church. They want to bring in a sense. Have you ever read Malcolm Gladwell's book? I'm not sure which one he has this statement in there, but it's the rule of 150. that human beings can get to know 150 people in their inner circle really well. But beyond that, and it's cross-cultural lines. It doesn't matter if you're in Botswana or if you're in Vietnam or if you're in Russia or the United States. Our capacity to sustain meaningful relationships is limited to about 150 people. That's a tight community. And people have recognized that we accomplish more as a group when we are in community with one another if we're willing to open the doors to the outside community and split and divide as time goes on. I was in a Bible study for 25 years with the same group of people. I think we made a mistake. We became a very closed cell group. We didn't incorporate others intentionally because we were so close to one another. We didn't allow anybody inside that group. I see healthy groups coming in and allowing people to come into that group and then taking a portion of that group and going out and doing it again and doing it again. That's the kingdom of God. That's the way the kingdom of God moves. So ministry size is going to be very important, whether we're a small ministry or a large ministry. Understanding ministry strengths, understanding ministry weaknesses. That's a really hard topic sometimes for me to have with folks, is to say, what are you really good at here? Everybody raises their hands and tells me, yeah, we do this. We're growing today because we have such an excellent approach towards childcare, or we've solved the security issue, or we have such great, whatever it is. We do this well, we do that. Or we brought this worship minister in who's really, really a blessing to our congregation. Okay, what do you do that's not so good? Nobody wants to raise their hand. Nobody wants to say, we're failing at this. We've tried it 3 times, we can't get over the hump. We don't know what to do. That's a hard conversation. Sometimes we're failing because we've tried it and the facility doesn't lend itself to be able to do it. We can't get people to cross the front door because our building is so unbelievably ugly. I'm sorry, but in our culture, we live in a culture where people value those kind of things. Some years ago, I was on a mission trip in 2004 to Cuba. After I joined Building God's Way, my whole spiritual life turned around a lot. And I went on a short-term mission trip, the first one, and I went to Cuba, and one night, we wandered up into the hills of Muriel, this little town on the north coast of Cuba, to worship together because we weren't allowed to do that due to the restrictions that the communist government had placed on gathering numbers of people. And we went in, and I'm thinking, well, I wonder what the church in the foothills looks like. And we go up into this little pathway up the side of the mountain, and we go into this forest, and there's a barn there. And we go up to the barn, and I can hear pigs. And they open the door, and they shooed the pigs out, and there's nothing but pig excrement everywhere. And I'm thinking, this is our church? So guys got up, climbed the trees, hacked off some palm fronds off the top of the banana trees and the palm trees, and laid them on the floor of the pig excrement, layered them in there, rolled in some palm logs. That was our church that night. It was one of the most worshipful experiences of my life. That doesn't work in America. We can't have pig barn worship in America. People have different expectations here. I did a project in Cali, Colombia, a group of 10,000 people meeting in a space that comfortably fit 800 people. They had 5 services. Do the math. They're sitting on each other's laps. We don't do that in America. We don't sit on each other's laps. They do that in Cali, Colombia. They live in those kinds of personal spaces. We don't do that here. We have to have really wide chairs so that we don't get cheek to cheek. Right? We have a different thing. Anyway, ministry strengths, very important. Identifying needs. It is important to get the needs out. I will design anything you want in a charrette, but I want a clear, compelling understanding of what phase 1 really looks like. Identifying needs is important. If not for now, for later, we need to be able to get it all on the table. I'll design you the sky, the moon, and the stars, but I want to show you a logical progression about how we get from here to here when things start to succeed or people start to respond to the building and so forth. But thinking about this, how can we use the building throughout the week, not just on Sundays? Dan used to say this all the time. The least used buildings in America today are NFL football stadiums and churches. Even when churches think they're busy, I can tell you they're not busy. I've had churches before say, yeah, we just use our facility all the time. Okay, what do you do? Well, on Wednesday night we have, kids in here. They start at about 5 o'clock cooking dinner. We have a big dinner. We have gals making spaghetti. And for 4 hours, we're just rocking and rolling. And then on Thursday mornings, every other Thursday, we have the women's group come in and meet in this room over here, and they have breakfast together. And then on Friday mornings, the men come over on the alternating Fridays, and we do that over in this room, and we have a good time of men's fellowship and teaching and so forth. And then on Saturdays, the kids come in and use the gym. And then on Sundays, of course, we have worship. And then, let's see, what else do we do? So is that it? Yeah, that's about it, but we're busy all the time. No, you're not. No. A women's group coming in on a Thursday for 2 hours on every other Thursday is not a compelling use of the building for Thursdays. A men's group coming in for breakfast every other Friday morning is not a compelling use of the building. Let's create some ways for people to use the building. Not just for us, but for the community, so that we can meet the community in the building. Let's figure out ways to do that. Right off the bat, people are going to trust churches for childcare and senior care. It's an implied trust. But churches have had bad experiences with childcare. I can't tell you how many churches I've been in where they either were at break even or they were subsidizing the ministry. My kids went to a church like that, 2.5 blocks up the street. Thank God it was there because we were broke at the time. But I sent my 3 kids there. They were there over the course of 9 years. Not one time did that church ever invite my wife and I to go to church there. Now, we went to another church. They had no idea. Not one time did they ever integrate with us. And I know they were losing money hand over fist up there because later I did a 28,000 square foot addition to their building and they told me how bad it had been run. There are ways, as Brian was up here talking earlier, there are ways to turn that around. Financially and ministerially. There are ways to do that. Don't try and run it yourselves unless you have a really, really good person who understands the business side of running that kind of thing. But childcare is an excellent way to bring people in. We have one in Ogden. Every other Friday night, they have movie night for the kids. It's date night for the parents. Most of these kids have 2 working parents. They don't even see each other, much less get out with one another. On Friday nights, Wasatch Christian Church, who also inhabits the building, offers as a ministry free babysitting and time for us to babysit your kids, watching a movie, having popcorn, running around the building, doing crazy kid stuff, while you guys go out and get to know each other. That's a ministry. That's an outreach. Now all of a sudden, those parents come back and go, now how did this happen? Well, this is Wasatch Christian Church, and we'd love to see you on Sunday morning or, get to know you a little bit, go out to coffee with you. That's ministry. That's connecting to a community. That's an intentional way of doing that through childcare. At the same time that the building is largely sustained for Wasatch Christian Church through the income coming in on that side. Very different way of thinking about that. Community centers. Matt's church. Did he talk about, I stepped out of the room for a few minutes to talk to somebody that had to leave. Did he talk about that? Yeah, his community center building. He's taken over the operation of this building. This is his building right here. 25,000 square feet, 750 seats. He moved in there in January of 2015. He went from 900 people to 1,500 by June of 2015. 6 months, 600 people, because he suddenly had a place that enabled them to grow, whereas before they couldn't do that. He suddenly had an AVL system that worked for him, and it was largely paid for by people that were coming in, Cannondale Bicycles and some of the other groups that I heard him relaying to you all earlier. So doing those kinds of things. Sometimes, by the way, it doesn't make sense to do an event center. So you got to look at this, you got to look at childcare, you got to look at sports and athletics as, does it make business sense? There's a pro forma exercise that is done to analyze from a business standpoint the way a chronic entrepreneur would do it. Does it make sense or not? If it doesn't make sense, don't go headlong into it. Don't go into a situation where you're denying the realities of a community situation. Make sure there's a market for it so that you can make sure that you have some success in that area. So allow people to do that. That's what sustainable, BGW Sustainable can do. Athletics and fitness. Fitness, we did one over in Olathe, Kansas, and every Wednesday morning, or Tuesdays and Thursday mornings, they set up exercise mats, interlocking mats in the main lobby space right next to the big indoor McDonald Land playground. And the moms in the church will invite their neighborhood peers who don't go to church to come in and exercise with them in a Zumba class while the kids are cared for through the big glass wall that they can see their kids. Proximity for moms is very, very important. And whether it be church, whether it be exercise classes, those kinds of things are important. Senior care, that's another area where we can fill a need. Depends on the area. Education centers, performing arts centers. Performing arts, great crossovers. These are good spaces that could be used. We were in one yesterday, a performing arts center that's used as a worship space on the weekend. Makes a lot of sense. Entrepreneurial centers. We just opened this one up in Salt Lake City, Utah, Salt Mine. A church out of Atlanta came to Salt Lake to open an entrepreneurial center to launch church. They have 3 churches in this building. But Monday through actually Saturday, it is a leased space for business people who are incubating businesses. It's top drawer space. It's also a pretty cool place to launch a church because they get to be in a space like this. Modern, clean, good space. So we're bridging this, we're crossing this line. It doesn't always make sense to cross that line, by the way. It doesn't always make sense, but sometimes it does. Thinking about cafe and third place. Have you heard the term third place before? Baby boomers largely operated out of 2 places, home and work. Relationships were built out of home and work, home and work, home and work. Baby boomers were crazy, driven. I have been, I still am. That's the way it is. It's my culture. Younger people coming in, Gen X, Gen Y, millennials, Gen Z. I don't know why millennials didn't get a letter, but they're Gen M or whatever they are. Third place, places you go to meet and have community. Reclaiming community. It's one of the things I mentioned earlier that millennials have taught us is the value of good community. It's changed the way housing is being done today. It's changing a lot of things. I have coffee every Saturday morning with the same 4 guys that I went to Promise Keepers with in Denver in 1996. For 22 years, we have time together to hear about each other's needs, talk about each other's issues, pray for one another, hold one another accountable, talk about how we're doing with God. Those are my 4 guys. Well, there's 4 of us total, 3 guys. Those guys meet in the same coffee house with me for 22 years. That's my third place. That's where I go. That is where we incorporate others too, by the way. We have incorporated and spun out groups from that group. We've learned the lesson from our Bible study to do that. Churches have figured out we can create third place. Thinking outside the box, thinking about marketplace. That's that whole notion of sustainable solutions. I'd encourage you to talk to us and to Eric more and more about that and find out, does it make sense? Creating people flow. This is a lobby at Tabor College in Hillsborough, Kansas. Space in Northland Church in Orlando, used throughout the week. We're essentially getting down to this diagram. Whether I'm talking to a group that's inside an existing historic building or whether I'm talking to a group that's out there creating a new building in a cornfield somewhere, we are always talking about this diagram. This is the community center diagram that I mentioned to you, but that my previous partner, Craig Elliott, would talk about all the time. Strong, compelling understanding of where front door is. When you guys approached the building, did anybody get lost this morning? I saw it from 2 cornfields over. I came up, I hadn't been up here to this particular branch of Northview. I came across and boom, there's the front door. I can see it. Glass, I can see inside the building. Let people see inside your building. Community centers don't hide themselves from the community. They open their building up. That central space, though, when you walk into it, has to be compelling space for people to be in. It has to be environmentally cool space, or warm space in the winter, or cool in regards to the feeling of the space. It has to be environmentally great. It has to be good space. It can't be too low. If it's too low and you have 300 people in there, it's going to feel squished and bad. It's got to be decent space. But if all you have is squished, at least have the space. Do it. Have that space. It's not a foyer. Right? That concept right there departs from our churches of the past. What were our churches of the past like? They were sequential churches. Churches that you went into and there was a little foyer and there was a place to worship, and sometimes you had to go through the worship to get to the kids areas, or you had to go in the basement underneath the building and then rise up to go find the kids wing. What were they doing? You'd walk into my church, the one that I was born in Christ in 1977, I'd walk in, get a bulletin and a guide map. They'd hand me breadcrumbs to go find my way. That's the way churches were done. And it didn't matter because people were building buildings sequentially as they needed to, because people were not making decisions about where to go to church based on the criteria that they're using today. They were making decisions about where to go to church based on what? Where they were raised. That's my denomination. That's where I go. It's almost like an assignment. People don't do that anymore. Not to the same measure. They don't think about those things. They think like shoppers. Are my kids going to be safe? Do they have the right education programs here? Is the coffee decent? If I'm getting coffee that tastes like warm water with a brown crayon dipped in it, they're not going to go there for coffee. You got to have decent coffee. It's an expectation. It's a hospitality expectation. Serve decent coffee. Because they're getting it 6 days a week. Serve decent coffee. Make it interconnected. Make it inviting. And when they come into that space, make sure they see everything. When you walk into this building here, you walk in. That's where I go to worship. That's where my bathrooms are. That's where I go get a cup of coffee. That's where I go get information. There's my administrational offices. There's my children's check-in point, my secure children's check-in point. Everything, boom, right there. Not, here's your guide map. Brother Joe's going to take you down the hall. He'll be back in a half an hour. Do your best to find us for worship. Different way of thinking. That's the way these buildings work. Make it good, compelling space. And what looks good to some communities doesn't look good to others, by the way. Florida has a very different aesthetic than does Southern California, than does Montana, than does Northern Wisconsin. People think differently about space. We think differently about the kinds of things that make us comfortable. Bring in some color. Color, by the way, folks, is free. It's free. You got to paint it anyway. Paint it a decent color. But know that in 5 years you're going to change that color, because color expresses relevancy. And what was relevant in 2017 when we opened that building in Winter Garden, Florida, it's going to be so 2017 in 2022. It's not going to be cool. I don't get it. I don't know. I don't know why. All I can tell you is that in our culture in America, there is no such thing as timeless architecture. It doesn't exist. My professors used to drill that into me. Whatever you do, it's got to stand the test of time. I'm sorry, the only thing that stands the test of time is flexibility, because it's going to change. I've had pastors tell me before, I want the ability to do something on the facade of this building that is so cool and compelling that I draw people in, but I want it to be changed in 10 years so that whatever is cool then changes. And I said, well, the best thing we could do is probably open it up with glass to allow them to see life inside the building. That's probably the greatest chance we have. But I don't know, what happens in 10 years? Maybe energy quadruples in cost and the glass doesn't make any sense anymore. We'll do something different. But buildings are going to change and morph, just like our wardrobes. 5 years ago, I wasn't doing these lectures like this with my shirt tails out. Not cool. In today's world, if you want to be cool, you find the shirt that you can do that with, that doesn't hang down to here. It's in our clothing, it's in our colors, it's in our houses, it's in the way that we decorate, it's the way that we adorn. I get it, it's all superficial, I understand that, I don't care. It's superficiality that you have to think about in a reasonable way to accommodate a community that you're trying to forge relationship to. Okay? So important for us to think about those kinds of things. Focus on hospitality. People respond well to that. These kinds of spaces that we're in today, these are hospitable spaces. These are good places. They've done some creative things here with light gels on the floor. That compass feature is a light gel passed from a light fixture. That's the way they change things. They're going to tire of that compass feature, and a couple of years from now, they'll do something different on the floor, or a year from now, or whatever it is, or next Sunday. They'll do something different in those spaces. Bring some information in. Bring that something, good graphics, by the way. No excuse for bad graphics. Bring some decent graphics in. Afford yourself a budget. Think about the way that people perceive in terms of their senses. You've heard of these shopper experiences before, where people go to your building and they tell you all the things starting in the parking lot about things that went wrong. I went into a church the other day. The parking lot was just a mass of alligator asphalt. I felt like I was going to fall in an asphalt hole driving through the parking lot and never get out. Fix your parking lot. Make sure it's a reasonable parking lot for people to drive on. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be reasonable. Solve that issue. These are things. The building, by the way, was beautiful. They had spent all the money on the building and had done nothing in the parking lot. You know, we got to think about people's first impressions. Think about how we connect indoors and outdoor spaces. I know the number of cloudy days that there are in central Indiana. I get that. But there are some good ones too. And there's times where if we orient the building in the right direction, there are times when we can blur the line between inside and outside space and take advantage of that. If for no other reason, we can show people to the community a little bit of life that bleeds out of the building onto the outside. So when it makes sense to put a couple of tables out there with some umbrellas and allow people to go out and share their coffee on a 60-degree day or 55, we can do that. We can have something on the outside of the building. Creating and fostering organic community. Bring some things in too in terms of design. if we can do simple soffits that curve, not structural curves, but non-structural curves, these are very organic human forms. People relate well to these kinds of things. You know, if we can afford to do that, not all churches can afford that, by the way. That's not a recommendation that's universal. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. But if you can, it's a very nice form, and it's not going to go out of style. People like that. I've learned that in my performing arts days. Thinking about relevancy is so important. How do we stay and how do we become and stay relevant? What do we do? Or do we create these religious museums? We don't want to be caught in that mode. Using your building as a bridge. Thinking about your building as a way to get people in. By the way, good architecture is not going to solve all the world's problems. Like my professors told me, that we're going to design our way out of this mess. It is not happening. If you're not ready to greet them, if you don't have a ministerial mindset to greet people when they finally get enough courage to walk through the front door of your building, and you're not there to greet them and to create relationship to them, good architecture doesn't matter. Don't do the project. Right? If you're not set, ready to go, don't do the project. Make sure that you have got that in order. Hub 757, this is over in Chesapeake. This is an event center and a child care center. It is fully supporting the church. This is what pays their mortgage. That was a dead project until they brought in the sustainable solutions to do these kinds of things. We have Hub 801 in Salt Lake or in Ogden that Matt's church meets in. The idea is to create event centers around the idea of hub area code so that we bring local identity into this thing and allow them to be used in that regard. For that reason, it doesn't necessarily want to look like a church. It needs to look like a community building. That's okay. We're not there creating monuments. There's a church that wanted to create something that looked like a ski lodge because they couldn't get men to come to church because they were going up in the hills to ski. So they created a ski lodge that the men like to be in. They've got this roaring fireplace and this huge, this is actually the second phase. The first phase that we did some years ago has a big roaring fireplace, real wood fireplace that's like 6 feet wide. They put these logs in there. The only thing missing from that space is the moose head. I mean, it's so cool. Men love to come to that building because it feels masculine. It feels right to them. Authentic feel. Make it authentic. Be real. That's the big thing in millennial culture, being real. That's why they like that warm industrial design. To them, it feels real. It doesn't feel pretentious. You know what my guys call the gabled church with the 4 columns out front? You've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them if you've driven through small communities. They call it phony colony. To them, it's not real. It's trying to be something that it's not. Trying to be pretentious. Be real. Figure out how to be real. Sometimes you can save those kinds of buildings though too. There's some pretty creative things that can be done to make those buildings relevant and feel real to them. Being relevant, very important. Bring some color in. That pumpkin orange and lime green was so 2009, I can't tell you. They've already changed the colors in that building to ice blue and some other color. So, being flexible. Last topic, we're going to talk about creating space. Don't box yourself in with buildings out of load-bearing masonry walls. Figure out how many different ways we can use space. When I come into a building and they say, well, we got this need for 40,000 square feet, but we can only afford 20,000 square feet, you can bet your bottom dollar we're going to have a talk about building flexibility. That's very important for us to be able to broach that subject and have that discussion. This happens to be a building that we had a big lobby in, and they use it for a Friday night concert series. They use it for their gathering space for dining. They also use it for, of course, the theatrical space. They use it for their student union is in this. The students abandoned their existing student union and started hanging out here because it was much cooler space than their student union, which was done like 1954 and hasn't changed a thing since then. This is a cool space that they like to use. So all kinds of things. And thinking about that through our master planning process, flexible master plans are going to be really, really important. So designing a master plan in such a way that we don't box ourselves into corners, making sure that we have ways to do that, is going to be very, very important. Being open to options, that's what this calls for, this process calls for, thinking about ways that we haven't had to think about them in the past and being open to that. I'll tell you, so many times I've been out on a charrette and I've talked to people that are dead set on a new building, and we find that their budgets are depleted, they're not ready for a new building, but there's this other building in the community that is just an ideal place, and it makes much more sense to go in and do a rebuild or a repurposing of a building, going in, doing a remodel on an existing building. People have a hard time seeing past the ugliness of a building like that. But there's so many good things that can be done. We've got several grocery store projects going on. We were meeting with some folks from Atlanta today. They're just getting ready to break ground. They purchased a 138,000 square foot Lowe's store south of Atlanta, and they're going to convert that into a church. And everybody in the church said, thought the pastor was crazy. But we showed them a clear, compelling vision for how that building could look to really make it work. Very important to be able to see past the surface of it. Both interior and exterior renderings greatly assist in that. So those kind of things can be done. I live in an age, I marvel at this. When I started working in architecture in 1979, I was drawing ruling pens, pen and ink, where I was dipping my pen into a jar of ink and gathering a bead of ink and bringing it out and drawing on linen. That's the way Leonardo da Vinci did it 400 years ago. In 1981, we started drawing on vellum. In 1982, we started drawing on mylar, plastic, graphite or plastic leads. In 1984, I started drawing on computers. In 5 years, I bridged 400 years of architectural technology. Being willing to think about how things get done is so important. Otherwise, you're not going to keep up. You're going to lose your ministry because we're not willing to do that. So very important for us to think about that. Okay, that is a primer on some of the things that we talk about during charrette times. I've mentioned there's a big homework stage to lead up to a charrette that has to be done. We talk about those things all the time. If I can help answer any questions, I will certainly do so. I've enjoyed being up here. I don't know if I tied all the loose ends together. I don't think I did that. I think all I did was allude a few times to the folks, but understand that we start from this basis of all these folks that came up ahead of me and talked is please, 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 let's get it in the right order. Let's understand where our ministry outreach ought to be, how we can do it, and then move towards facilities, because facilities are a tool that are a response to that, not an end in of themselves. Not a award device for some architect or something that's built in homage to a committee or to a building committee or a congregation. So thank you for listening to me today. If I can help you, I would be more than willing to do that. And I'd be more than willing to tell you I'm not the right guy too.